to queue up here. I'll tell you when to begin.
Well, thank you for joining us today. This is Janet Wilson from the Monterey County Branch of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And we're going to show a short 4-minute video as we're allowing other people to go ahead and join. It's called Public Banking Sweeps the Nation. It's only about 4 minutes. And then I'll come back and tell you about WILPF and perhaps entice you to join. If Catherine Crockett is running the show and she's going to start the video now.
All right.
And we should mute.
Yes, please. Yeah.
And then I'll come back and tell you about WILPF and perhaps entice you to join. If Catherine Crockett is
Just a moment.
do you want me to tell them?
All across the country, from Maine to Hawaii, Alaska to Florida, California to New York, people are taking back their power from Wall Street by calling for public banks.
We want New York City to take our public dollars out of those banks. Yeah. We want New York City to put that money in a public bank.
Why do we need to have to go to Wall Street about our basic needs and necessities of life?
Enter public banking, a bank owned by our local government.
All across the country, public banking movements are rising. From Los Angeles to San Francisco, to Seattle, to Washington, D.C., the state of New Jersey, the state of Michigan, to New York City and Alexandria's home state. We are witnessing the emergence of an idea whose time has come.
Yes.
Ever since Ellen Brown reintroduced the idea of public banking to the United States in 2011, the idea has inspired more and more people.
So it would behoove our state and local governments to set up their own banks right now, just if only to keep their deposits safe and leverage your funds into credit for your local community.
Imagine a bank whose sole purpose is to make sure that the economy is stronger. That's what a public bank can do. Traditionally, the city of Chicago pays hundreds of millions of dollars in fees and fines and interest rates to traditional financial institutions. And we have to wonder, what is the return on that investment? A public bank actually recirculates dollars back into the city's economy. With a public bank, there is accountability and there's transparency.
Elected officials and advocates now realize it makes much more sense to cut out the Wall Street middleman by owning their own bank.
So some people say, why do we need a public bank? Let's be very clear. Private corporations are not meant to do the business of public good, which is why we need a public bank.
One of the bills that I want to draw particular attention is my bill to create a publicly owned State Bank of Washington. So the state of Washington's bank account is at the Bank of America. We have a better use for our resources. Why don't we create our own publicly owned bank, owned by us, the taxpayers, and then we can keep our tax money in Washington State and working for Washington State.
I'm a big believer in something called the public bank. So here's the idea. all those deposits come on home. They reside in the People's Bank of New Jersey, owned by the citizens.
We don't need Washington to form a public bank. You can do it here. The state can do it. States, cities, counties, all across America can do this.
With a public bank, a city or state can extend credit to themselves at low interest rates, pay themselves back, and keep the profits in the community.
By borrowing money at a fraction of what we borrow it at now, that would really be the biggest help.
When the crash hit, the Bank of North Dakota never blinked, and the credit kept flowing. We can go toe-to-toe with the big boys.
I think that money should be a public utility, not a means of further consolidating wealth.
The idea is motivating. Since 2017, over 26 states and municipalities have introduced new public bank legislation. More than 50 grassroots groups are working across the country.
So today we are dropping 1,200 pages of signatures. We've got 40,000 signatures of support in this motion, and that we want to move towards a public banking system that is for the 99%.
Carlos, what are you doing?
Hey! I'm live streaming, folks.
Yeah!
Hey!
Yes, on beat.
Yes, on beat.
Yes, on beat.
In California, over 150 organizations in over a dozen major cities and counties have voted to support the Public Banking Act, AB 857, which makes it possible for cities to set up their own public banks. Through the hard work of advocates and sponsors, the bill has passed the Assembly and 2 Senate committees. News outlets are paying attention. This success has inspired New York State to introduce a similar bill, S 5565, giving New York's cities a pathway to their own public banks. Join the movement. Go to publicbankinginstitute.org.
Well, thank you. I hope that gave everybody a chance to sign in. I'm Janet Wilson with the Monterey County Branch of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and I want to welcome everybody tonight. This is a joint venture between the Monterey County Branch of WILPF and the Monterey Peace and Justice Center. I want to thank Catherine Crockett for running all the Zoom stuff, and thank our speakers and Lynn for showing up. I'm just going to try to entice you to join WILPF and then turn everything over to Lynn, who will introduce people. The International WILPF was formed in 1915 when a bunch of really strong women got together in The Hague and were trying to convince the men of the world to stop the war. So we're still working on that. Our voices are getting stronger, but we are still working on it. There are a bunch of focus groups with WILPF these days that are very interesting. And that's how I'm hoping to entice you to join WILPF. We work on not only peace, equality, social justice, but we work on things about the environment and other things as well. You can go to just Google, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and you'll find all that information. As well as if you Google our local chapter, you'll see how to join us. And if anybody doesn't have the financial means to join, there is someone locally that has volunteered to sponsor people their first year if they need that. So without further ado, thanks everybody. And I'm going to turn this over to Lynn Hamilton.
Thank you, Janet. And thanks everyone for being here. Welcome to our speakers tonight, Randa Solick and Tyller Williamson, who are both members of People for Public Banking on the Central Coast. Randa Solick is a longtime member of the Santa Cruz branch of WILPF that Janet was just talking about, and a co-chair of the WILPF National Issue Committee, Earth Democracy. She's a grandmother, a gardener, and she's involved with promoting public banking and helping asylum seekers. Tyller Williamson is a Monterey City Council member and currently vice mayor. He has worked at the Naval Postgraduate School, has a BA from Cal State Monterey Bay, and an MBA from Naval Postgraduate. One of his major focuses is affordable housing, and he's a member of the Monterey County Housing Advisory Committee. He also leads the Monterey Peninsula Housing Coalition, made up of electeds from across the peninsula, with the aim of advancing regional solutions to our housing problems. So welcome, and thank you, Randa and Tyler, for coming this evening. And Randa, would you like to start?
Hello, everybody. That was a nice introduction. Thank you. And thank you to the Monterey Branch for hosting this. We appreciate it. I'm going to start with a story. In 1918, the farmers in North Dakota were really angry. They were angry at the robber barons who owned the railroads and owned their granaries and owned their banks and were sucking the lifeblood out of the farmers. And the farmers decided to join it themselves together and form their own bank. That was the Public Bank of North Dakota, and it's been going now for more than 100 successful years. They made low interest loans to farmers. They made low interest loans to small businesses. They reduced their kids' interest on their student loans, and they supported fracking. Wait, what? They supported fracking? Yes, because a public bank is run by an elected board that answers to the needs of the local community. If we had a public bank here, we certainly would have different priorities. But the North Dakotans have found it very beneficial to them to have a bank that actually works for them. And they don't put any of their state money into Wall Street banks. All of the money from the state of North Dakota taxes go into the Public Bank of North Dakota. And they've been doing extraordinarily well. In the 2008 recession, they didn't care at all. They sailed right through that recession. There was no problem. If we had a public bank in California, we would be doing the same thing. We would be fighting the current day robber barons, the 1% who are controlling our banks right now. And Occupy Wall Street made us all very cognizant of where the money is. Now we need to understand how we can get power from that money. There is one other public bank in the United States. It's in Oklahoma. It's the Chickasaw Community Bank. The Chickasaw Nation decided that they're going to do the same thing, control their own money. And that's been going for decades too. And this is not a new idea. Globally, 40% of banks are publicly owned, which we never hear about. So Germany and Australia and India and France and Scotland and China and Brazil and Taiwan, they all have some public banks. And as you saw in that video, in the United States, over 20 states and many large cities are actively working toward public banking. Let me show that again for 1 minute. I'll share the screen for a second and let's do that. This is pretty amazing. That this is last year. And so we see that North Dakota is the only one with it established already. But look at all of those in California that are working toward it right now. And the governor of New Jersey is totally for it. He's going for it. These other states are either studying it or they have feasibility studies going or they have legislation pending. And it's pretty impressive how much this idea has spread. It's especially spread because of COVID. This is a perfect answer to COVID because every community is suffering an economic downturn. And this is a way to keep money in our own community. So the recent public banking movement started in 2016 by Indigenous people who were protesting the oil pipelines. They wanted the city of Seattle to stop doing business with Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo is a major funder of the Dakota pipeline. And then this grew from there. We all know what happened at Standing Rock. It grew as the protests grew, so did the idea of, wait a minute, we should be controlling our own money. And nationally now, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has public banking in her proposal for the Green New Deal. So we're on a roll. In California, we were part of the successful team that got Assembly Bill 857 passed and signed by the governor. So now we in California have authorized 10 public banks over the next 7 years, I think. Hal or George can check that out. And it authorizes public agency participation. An agency is a county or a city or a state or a water district or a school district or a pension fund. It authorizes agencies to put their money in public banking, and it lays out how they can deposit that kind of money. So you saw from the video, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Jose, Santa Cruz, East Bay, San Diego, and many more were in a coalition called the California Public Banking Alliance. And you can look that up, CPBA, and see how far this is spreading. So let's just start the very basic thing about public banking. It's not a consumer bank. We, people here at this meeting, are not going to bank there. It's not for us. It's not going to replace our credit unions or our local banks. This is a bank for what we're calling agencies or institutions. So any government agency that can afford it can go into a public bank. It's not for people. So the first thing is, it's not for people, but it's owned by us. So if a state or a city or a community or even a nation has a public bank, it's owned by the people in that area. And it serves as a depository for government funds. So a government of any size can put in their reserve funds or a city or state taxes or fees. They can decide what they want to put into the bank. But they're required to benefit the public by serving their community's needs. So it's quite opposite from what Wall Street banks do, which is line the pockets of their CEOs and their investors. And that's their purpose. This purpose is to reinvest money in the community. So it will provide a new source of income for cities and states, a source for infrastructure, or what Tyler is working on, a source for housing that we're all going crazy with, trying to find how we're going to get money for affordable housing. Or what Pauline is working on, renewable energy. How are we going to save the earth? We only have 10 years to do it. We need the money to do that. All of our communities need that money right now. And public banks aren't run by politicians, but by actual bankers, qualified bankers on a locally elected board. And that board can have public people too, can have input from the public as well. A public bank provides accountability and transparency, so we can see where our money is being invested. We don't want it to go to pipelines. We don't want it to go to fracking. Where we want it to go, we can direct it. And also, because of that kind of growth, it can create new jobs. So it can spur and support small businesses, and it can partner and support credit unions and small banks, small community banks, because it can extend how much they can lend. It can support them. It won't be in competition with them. And the last thing is, public banks can lend during times of crisis, right? So what we decide we need at a particular time, the public bank money can be available to us to help us sustain a local economy. So the best thing is about it, that will address local issues. It benefits us like affordable housing and small business loans and public infrastructure and rebuilding after wildfires. Whatever it is that our community needs, we can direct the money from the public banks there. And the bank will return the interest and the fees to the communities that they serve. So normally, well, like Los Angeles had a stretch of highway 2 years ago. They spent $16 million to repair that highway and $16 million in the bank fees. So you can imagine we can double how much money we actually have available for the stuff that we want done. Public financing of housing and infrastructure, open student loan question up, tuition finances. The reason that it is like that is that there's an elected board. So each community, whether it's a county or a coalition of counties or the state, each community will elect a board to represent what they want on the board. So say Monterey County wants more public housing, and Santa Barbara County wants ocean cleanup, and Santa Cruz wants some deal with their transportation. They will all have representatives on a board and can put in what they want for the money that they have in there. And a Citizens Advisory Commission can be established to monitor what they're doing, so we can actually see what's going on. Environmental investment is just number one for all of us. We don't have much time. We need the money to do this, and we need it fast. And this is the way to get the money from Wall Street bankers and put it back into our communities. So the green technologies that we need financing, we could have money for that. Especially right now in the COVID response, public banks can invest in disaster resilient infrastructure. Wall Street banks don't care about that. So what we can do is we can fund fire prevention. We can fund hospital supply chains and earthquake readiness and green energy infrastructure. We can get ready for the next disaster that's coming, because it's coming. And our public banking has a way to make our communities much more resilient. So I want to mention the WILPF Public Banking Toolkit. There's a WILPF National Committee called Women, Money, and Democracy. And if you go to the US WILPF website, you can find it there. This public banking toolkit has all this stuff listed there. No need to take notes on any of this stuff or to wonder where you can get any of this. The videos, the resources, all the citations are on this public banking website, and you'll find it on the National WILPF website. And then the question is, so why is the Women's Peace Organization interested in public banking? And I think it's pretty apparent to all of us, especially working for peace and justice, as you all do in Monterey, because the economic inequality and corruption inevitably lead to conflict and violence. So if we're interested in economic justice and people-centered economic policies to support peace, this is one way to do it. And you could see from that map, it's spreading all across the country. We know that the big transnational banks are wielding more and more power, nationally and internationally. They're using the money that we put in there to bankroll exploitive industries, right? Extractive mining and oil and fossil fuels, and to buy elected officials and to gut regulations. So currently, Wall Street banking is threatening democracy and shaping their policies in favor of the 1% that are making money from that. So we can take that back. Our allies in peace activism and environmental activism and gun and weapons control and social justice, all of them want to work against government corruption, and we can't do that with having all of our money in multinational banks, the too big to fail banks. They're just making them their own profits. So in summary, public banking can't guarantee everything on our wish list, but it can prioritize the values that we want to put in there. We can direct local investments to local projects, and we can provide a long-term source of stable financing to local governments. Lastly, I want to emphasize again, we will partner with community credit unions and with the local community banks so that they can continue to make loans in our neighborhoods. Let me say that on the web, there are 4 really good sites. Nationally, the Public Banking Institute, you can look that up. Statewide, we're in this alliance, the California Public Banking Alliance, CPBA, and you can look that up. Our Santa Cruz, Monterey, Santa Barbara, San Benito, hopefully, and San Luis Obispo group, we call ourselves People for Public Banking Central Coast. And we have a really good website with links to all sorts of places that you'd want to see. So locally, People for Public Banking Central Coast. And that's what Tyler is going to talk about now, what we're doing locally here. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Randa. That was great. I could go on and listen to you, and I'm sure you have a lot more info that you can share. So I look forward to doing the Q&As with you after I can share a few comments with the group. So, you know, I'll kind of tag along with what Randa was saying, specifically about values. I think values is a really important element of why there's so much interest in this and why there's such a great need for us to move in this direction. And so one of the things that I think is really important is we might want to think about it in a way of us having control of it as a public body. It might be a way for those that might think about this in a little bit more of a conservative space as controlling spending, right? So if we own it, we might take more ownership about where we're investing our money into and make a really conscious decision about making sure that we're investing things that will provide returns so that we can keep the funding circulating and stay effectively afloat. You know, some other things when we think about values are some ethical concerns, right? So wage theft, right? Are folks receiving appropriate wages and benefits for the work that they're doing? investment in fossil fuels, like Rhonda was saying, that's obviously, there's a huge intersection with the direction that we're going with in policy making these days, and a huge benefit for us to start advancing green energy jobs, and again, keeping funding locally. And then controlling in the standards of investments in their values. Again, we have that local control, and I think there's just a lot of value in that. One of the things that I think about when we have this discussion is by going this direction, we're going to be able to make decisions on behalf of the public, as opposed to corporations making decisions on behalf of their shareholders, right? So we have to have the public's interest in mind. And again, we're keeping those dollars here locally. So there's that level of ownership that's not happening from the citizens' perspective from corporations. Some other things to think about is how the structure works is the local agencies will be able to. So Rhonda was speaking to how the different infrastructure projects and how it would be at such a greater price point. Those loans would be costing the public a lot more money with corporate banks. We'll be able to charge lower interest to the public agencies, and then those funds that do come back are reinvested within the community. So it's really important for cost saving purposes alone. And then when we also think about the cost saving conversation, it's also important for us to think about the more affordable overhead. As you can imagine, CEOs are getting paid millions of dollars. And so if we can cut a lot of that overhead off and have an administrative cost that is affordable with public jobs, and provide a decent salary for these folks too, there's added value to that there. And then again, I can't stress enough the idea of the funding staying local, right? So instead of going to folks that are probably stashing money in the Cayman Islands or just outside of our region, we circulate those funds here locally, and it just kind of helps create more vibrant and healthy communities for us all. And then, there was something else that Rhonda was sharing that I think is important, which is this idea of, in a way, starting small, right? So if we think about, from a value perspective, if we think about how change happens, it does happen small, right? The small decisions that we make every day. As individuals, it's difficult, right? You might recycle, your neighbors might not. And so how do we create these changes? Well, this is a great way of creating change within our community by starting small, starting locally. All politics is local. So I just encourage folks to connect with your local elected officials. I know that, and jump in and correct me if I'm missing a city here, but as far as Monterey County, the local municipalities that have already moved forward on taking action are Monterey County. That just happened, was it yesterday or sometime earlier this week? That was a win. And then also Delray Oaks. So we're already getting some movement to happen here within the county. I also know that there's support on the Monterey Council. I'm hoping that we can move forward with passing a resolution so that we can get added to that list within the county. And then there's also support on the Seaside City Council and Marina. I saw in the chat that somebody's here from PG. So I'm not sure if you know of anybody on your council that might be in support, but I just encourage folks to be persistent and start connecting with your local elected officials. And so let me just kind of go through the phases. So I kind of given some of my values perspective, but let me just kind of go from a local perspective of how this kind of works. So the larger question is, do we want to do this? And my assumption is that everybody here, or probably the majority of you, are very much in favor of this. It almost seems like a kind of common sense thing, but that's not the same belief that everybody has, right? So I think it's really important to not try to approach this topic assuming that just because it might seem like common sense to some of us, that it's that way for everybody. And it's going to take a lot of work to get this to happen. So I encourage you to yes, maybe understand that folks don't operate that way, and maybe find a way of being able to answer those questions that they might have. And if you can't, come back to some of those resources that Randa was speaking to. And there's plenty of folks that are part of our group that do have the information that can help support you in getting you those questions answered. So that's the big question at the end of the day, is should we be doing this? And I just really encourage folks to make sure that we, as much as possible at this point, stay focused there. But I will go down a little bit to go down to the granular level, just so that we can understand the direction that we're going in. So can we get these resolutions passed in all the cities? That would be a great goal. From my perspective in Monterey County, is getting a resolution passed in as many cities as possible within the county. Then from there, we would be looking at the idea of a viability study, which is part of the resolution. I think the resolution kind of indicates that, leans towards that a little bit. But the idea is that we all find a cost model that supports equitably distributing the cost of a viability study. And so we all contribute to that. And to me, that, and again, not everybody thinks this way, but to me, that's the no-brainer, right? I might have a lot of questions about how it's going to work, how it's going to function. And I don't really think that nobody at this stage can really fully address that, because we have to see some data, do some research that by experts to determine if this is the direction that we want to go in. I think that there is enough of an appeal of it for us to be able to get to the point of at least doing a viability study. And then let's look at the data and determine if and how we're going to move forward from there. So the viability study is the big next step in my eyes. And that's going to require dedicated funding. And then from there, just chiseling down a little bit further, there's a business plan. And from that, it's just kind of look at how do we, okay, so if we're deciding to move forward at that point, what is this going to look like? And so we're looking at things like, is it going to be a mutual benefit corporation or a public beneficial corporation? So how is this going to work? And then chiseling down to I think the kind of almost last step that we see in our mapping is, really at that point, we're going forward with it. We're now looking for office space. We're looking for staff, right? Obviously, that's not where we're at right now, but just to kind of give you the kind of roadmap about how this looks moving forward. So there's a lot of work to do. I brought this forward to the Monterey City Council. We've had a discussion of this on our council. There were some questions posed. I plan on bringing that back hopefully soon to the council with some of the questions, answering all the questions that were asked, so that they are informed enough to hopefully feel comfortable enough in passing a resolution. And then we'll just keep an eye on this as this moves forward. So I'll end there, and then I'm really interested in hearing what those questions are out there, and I'll probably lean on you more so, Randa, but I look forward to the discussion, and I appreciate everybody's being here and supporting the cause.
Thank you both so much. I would just add that there are even forms in the toolkit on several of these resource sites that Randa mentioned. There are forms you can use, and you can endorse the idea or the viability study as a group, if you belong to a group or several, or you can just do it as an individual. So let's advocate, those of you who have decided to advocate. So I think that people can ask questions in the chat. Are there any comments or questions? So far, I just see hi. Everyone's saying hi. So if you want to use chat, that's fine. If you'd rather just raise your hand, that's fine. But you have to unmute yourself. Or maybe Catherine can unmute everyone. Okay, Andy?
Yeah, my question has to do, I know that you're reaching out to city government and county governments right now to fund the viability study. If and when a public bank is established in the region, can other public agencies bank with it? For instance, school districts, water boards, other public agencies within the region. Can they?
Rafa, could you answer that one? Rafa might be a good one to answer that.
So the short answer is yes. Agencies would need to pass some changes to their investment policies that would allow them to invest with a public bank, but it's definitely theoretically possible. There's nothing preventing a local agency from becoming a member of a public bank. An agency like a school district or a water board wouldn't be a founding charter member. That would be limited to cities and counties, but they could definitely be a depository.
Thank you. So I see Beverly's hand. Oh, did you want to follow up, Andy? Okay, Beverly
has something to.
Yes, I have a pretty basic question. Where's the money coming from? I'd like to understand this a little bit better. I heard of North Dakota put all its tax money in the bank. And I can understand even if all these municipalities put their tax money in the bank, when it comes to projects, they borrow money and they pay high interest to Wall Street. So where does this money come from that's going to be borrowed at such better interest rates if the source of funds is these municipalities themselves?
So Tyler or Randa?
Yeah. When we went to Santa Cruz City to ask them a few years ago, or would they be interested in this? They said, well, you know, we have some funds that are called what is it? Restricted funds? No, reserve funds. They had $16 million sitting in reserve funds, and reserve funds, our county treasurer told us this too, reserve funds are usually set aside for emergencies or projects at a very low interest rate in a secure place. So that would be one place that a city or a county could say, well, we'll take a certain amount of our reserve funds and help fund the bank with that. There is a group of, okay, so I'm not a banker and most of us aren't bankers, but we do have some bankers on that are working with us. And Brad and Rafa are members who participate in the CPBA meetings, and they have lawyers and bankers working with them. They're trying to form a public bankers association, or at least a coalition, to work out exactly where that kind of funding would come from. Because truthfully, it's not only the funding. Capitalizing is only part of where a bank has to put its initial money. There's also collateralization. Like if Santa Cruz were to make a public bank, would we want to put up our civic center for collateral? Probably not. We probably wouldn't want to do that. What would we use for collateral? So the two money questions, collateralization and capitalization, are really banking questions that need to be answered by people who know what they're talking about. But what we know is that, number one, no city or county in our 5-county area has enough money to do a public bank by itself. We need all these counties to do it together to make sure that we have enough money for those two needs. And when most of us are activists, right? When we get down to the banking questions, there's a division of the state government that actually controls this and writes exactly the laws specifying what steps you need to take in order to capitalize and collateralize a public bank. Those are being written right now. I think that Public Banking East Bay is the closest to figuring out what steps to take. There's someone here on that from the East Bay, and maybe she can talk about that. But because we have to follow certain state laws, what we need first is a viability study, just what Tyler was saying. We need a viability study to say, well, how much money do all these counties and cities have together? And then we need a business plan. This is how we'll structure the bank. The reason that our supervisor, Zach Friend, wrote to all the elected officials in all of your and my counties and cities is to ask them, are they interested in getting together to talk about how we would fund a viability study? And already Santa Cruz and Santa Barbara have already decided that they have some money to put into this viability study. We don't have to answer those questions right now. What we need to do is get professionals to lay us out a business plan.
Okay.
So
Tyler
or
wanted to add to that.
Okay, and then maybe Hal and Brett can add too, because they all have, and George, they've all been dealing with this stuff.
Yeah, no, I would defer. Sorry, I was doing some movement because my light went off, and I just realized that I didn't have it plugged in. So, no, I would defer to Brett or Rafa. I'm sorry, Brett. I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Let me add, a similar question came from Harold in the chat about how to equitably divide up the cost of the viability study.
Could I have a follow-up question? Because I don't feel that I have gotten the slightest answer to my question. I understand that the Bank of North Dakota has done this successfully. It seems to me that if that is the case, someone ought to be able to make a simple explanation of how capitalization works or where their money comes from. It's very basic. They've done it. So I don't know the answer, but before I did a viability study, I'd like to understand the basic principle.
Randa, you're muted if you're trying to talk to the group.
Unmute yourself, please, Randa.
I did. The way that North Dakota did it, we are not going to do. North Dakota has 600,000 people. They put all their taxes into their public bank. It's called the state of North Dakota doing business as the Public Bank of North Dakota. We're not going to do that. There isn't any scenario that I can think of that all the counties here would put all their tax money or the state money into that. That's not going to happen. So what a business plan will do for us and a viability study will do is to show us where there are like reserve funds and other fees and things that people pay for that the cities and the counties put away right now, where those are located, which ones the counties might be willing to, to invest in. They also have all sorts of strictures from the state. The county treasurers are obligated to have certain rules before they can invest in any kind of new bank. So there's a Assembly Bill 857 spelled out a lot of this. Then there's a public agency that's actually going to write down the steps, and that's what we'll find out from our viability study. So Hal and Rafa and George, and Brett, they've all been dealing with this question because we're all thinking about that. And our answer so far has been, okay, here's what we need. We need a study to see where that can come from and if we can actually have a bank like that here.
Okay. Would anyone like to continue on that? I see Andy's hand up.
Yeah, my understanding, and maybe I'm wrong because I haven't read the legislation that enabled these regional public banks here in California, but I had thought that public banks had the ability to draw directly from the Federal Reserve, which is, at very, very low interest, like any commercial bank, which rather than, so if our Central California Bank or Central Coast Bank could go directly to the Federal Reserve rather than through an intermediary like Bank of America or Wells Fargo, we could get money at a much cheaper rate. Am I right about this?
Well, I'll jump in and just say one thing I do understand from the model is that, so if we look at the pandemic and when it rolled out, all of the funding that came out from the federal government, the Paycheck Protection funding, North Dakota was able to respond and react and distribute that funding a lot faster than anybody else was, because they had the public banking established. So, there is, I think, more cohesiveness where if we were passing it from public agency to a public agency, I think that there's it just allows that process to happen a little bit smoother. But as far as startup funding, I'm not sure about that, and I couldn't speak to it.
George?
I've done some research on where the money comes from, and this goes back to Bev's question about where does the money come from. Every public agency now, special districts, school districts, counties, cities, they have reserve funds. And I think Randa mentioned this before, maybe Tyler did too. That's money that they keep in reserve. It's not allocated for an expense. It's in reserve. It kind of underpins the financial stability of a public agency. They have reserve funds available to meet rainy day demands or crises or whatever. They have this money available. They pool it now with various state agencies, as well as federal agencies, as well as access to the Federal Reserve and Treasury notes and so on. Where the money comes from for capitalization, or the money that goes into the bank in order to have the ability to leverage for loans, that money is a portion of, and I think Tyler made this point very clearly, there's a portion of that money that could be put into a public bank in order to have public priorities locally decided in a transparent way to serve the local community. Right now, the reserve funds are invested in treasury notes, invested in pooled accounts, invested in corporate banks, Wall Street banks. What we're asking is that there's a small percentage, probably in the neighborhood of 20%, 15%, 10%. We just don't know yet because we didn't have a study made. But let's just hypothetically, if 15% of public agency reserves could be put into a public bank, that provides the investment for, and they expect a return on that, because right now it's invested in expected a return. But the new structure would be return also from local financing of projects, and it's going to be a loan. It's going to have to be paid back. There's going to be collateral related to it. It's going to be a bank. Don't forget, it's a bank. Banks are not intended to lose money, so they're going to make money, and they're going to do it with lower rates and lower interest rates and fees. And that's the potential, and that's the design, and that's still to unfold in the future. We need to do a viability study to kind of see how much money we need. The big players are going to be the counties because they have the most money, and every city has some money available. Every special district or even a JPA, even like Monterey One Water or the landfill operation, they're JPAs. They have reserve money also, and a portion of that money could be invested in a public bank and expect the same return. I mean, I'm going to say the same style of return from the activity of a public bank. And the return will be income that can be fed back into public agencies, member agencies, or local projects. Whatever it is, it's local control, transparent, and using local money, keeping local money local.
Okay, thank you. And it looks like Margie Lewis has a question, hand up.
No, I was just going to answer and say, everybody like LA and the East Bay and everybody is grappling with this question of capitalization. And part of the thing that and even though counties, cities, all these reserve funds, there is money out there. What we are grappling with is the fear of the unknown and the sort of the feeling comfortable with the devil you know versus the devil you don't. Because everyone knows the criminal bank of Wells Fargo, yet they seem to feel more comfortable with that than a public bank, which is going to have more oversight even than those banks. And so one of the ways to think about overcoming that, besides education, is people power. And getting together and letting the elected officials understand that the people have voted them in, labor is supporting them a lot monetarily, and that they have to understand that they have to reflect what the people want. So that's a big thing, is the boots on the ground organizing. So the people come and then you say to them, this is what we want.
Yes, I was just listening to the author of Braiding Sweetgrass today on a different Zoom, and she was talking about colonialization. And I kind of thought, oh, this is kind of like decolonializing our money. This is our money. Rafa, you were next, I think. You had have a hand up.
Yeah, so I just wanted to address a couple questions in the chat from Audra. One was a question: how does public banking create the interest that it would pay on the community's savings? And first, I would just wanted to mention I'm not a banker, but I think at a most basic level, we all understand that banks make money on interest from loans that they issue to their customers. And a public bank would be no different. It's just that the loans that they choose to make are loans that the community has a say in terms of the values that we want. The bank in North Dakota, they have programs related to like flood, farmer flood losses and things like that, and they can be, and I don't understand the technical details, but essentially a conduit to local credit unions and local commercial banks to prioritize local priorities for community investment. The local credit unions and the local public banks will make loans to local businesses. They will borrow money from the public bank, and so there's a return from that borrowed money. There's interest paid, and that interest that's paid back to the public bank can then be basically the profits that the bank takes in, and essentially is the interest on the investment. And to answer another question that Audra had regarding how does a public bank help communities divest from the military and industrial complex and fossil fuels, et cetera. Right now, the status quo is a city or a county, when they have cash reserves, those cash reserves are invested in things like commercial paper, which is like loans to companies. Like Santa Cruz County, for example, has loaned money to Walmart. They own Walmart commercial paper. There are other very safe sorts of investment instruments that they own, and they have savings accounts and money market accounts with Wall Street banks. And the Wall Street bank uses the public's money and can invest it in essentially whatever it wants, whether that's the military industrial complex or oil companies or whatever. So that's how, you know, our local money ends up in Wall Street banks and funds the military industrial complex, fossil fuels, et cetera. A local public bank, on the other hand, would not be, would not, excuse me, necessarily be required, or, well, it could have investment value statements where how it chooses to invest its money can be on local priorities, and there it could have a very clear goal of not investing in fossil fuels or not investing in military type companies.
Right. Thank you. And I see Harold, you have your hand up.
Yes, hi, Tyler. I'm happy to see you here tonight. As I understand it, you're a member of the City Council for the City of Monterey, right?
Yes, sir, I am. And I think I also saw our mayor on here tonight too. So I'm not sure if he's still with us, but he was here a second ago.
Oh, good.
Well, I'm an advocate for People for Public Banking Central Coast in Santa Barbara. And I've been in dialogue with members of the City Council, and they're trying to decide, you know, how to equitably distribute this money. Has there been any discussion in Monterey City Council about how to determine how much they should contribute to the viability study?
I'm trying to get my colleagues to even support the idea that it's a reasonable solution, which is when I was speaking earlier, kind of the idea of should we do this? That's kind of why I was really focused there, because I'm really just trying to convince my colleagues that it's worth doing. So we haven't gotten to that point, but I think if I can get my colleagues to understand that it's worth doing the viability study, I'm sure that the city of Monterey would be willing to pay our fair share.
Very good.
Okay, it looks like we've got just another minute or two.
If I could just add one, because there was a conversation going on here, and I think it's really relevant. So, you know, will we ultimately potentially end up using some of our reserve funding? And I think that's a very likely possibility, and that's a risk. It's obviously a risk, right? What if in a year from now, let's say we do it towards the end of the year, and in a year from now, we go into a recession and our local agencies are struggling financially, and they would dip into that reserve that is no longer maybe completely available to them. So there is absolutely a risk with it. I think the question we have to ask ourselves is it a risk worth taking? Instead of this idea of kicking the can down the road and letting future generations try to work on this or solve this, I think is an irresponsible lack of leadership from public agencies. I think that we need to do this in a smart way, right? And I don't think that it's clear that we can't say, okay, use all your reserves. So I think there is some expectation that we say, hey, maybe keep on to a portion of it. And that's a conversation that we should have around the topic. And then one of the things as part of the viability study that we could look at is saying, hey, why don't we make an agreement to say that we will not only support and prioritize refilling your coffers, your reserve coffers, but we'll support you increasing them so that you are more secure and more safe in out years as we move forward, right? But we have to figure out how do we get this to happen. So that's the solution, and I think it's going to take real leadership.
Okay, Randa.
Yeah, I want to share what we're actually asking you to do right now. We have sent this resolution to all the elected officials in all the counties and every city in the county too. We, meaning Zach Friend, who's on one of our board of supervisors, he's a Santa Cruz County supervisor. He sent this resolution. It has all the whereases, so you can all read this. And this is stuff that we've been talking about. But the Santa Cruz Board of Supervisors taking the lead on funding for a viability study. And so what we're asking for is for your agencies or your cities or your counties to express an initial interest in participating in a viability study. That's what we want all the activists to ask your elected officials. That's what we want you to ask the elected officials. Just get together with the Santa Barbara, Monterey, Santa Cruz Board of Supervisors and talk about a viability study. So to do that, that agency has to send a letter to Zach Friend expressing an initial interest. It doesn't mean that they're going to have any commitment to do any money, just talk about how we all can work together, because what Tyler is saying is that it's irresponsible if we don't at least talk to each other and see how this can work out. We don't have to have the answers before they start talking to each other. So George in Monterey and Hal in Santa Barbara and many people in different cities are trying to just get their elected officials to write to Zach and say, okay, we're in for the talk. They're not committing themselves to anything, but that's what we're really asking. And we've been trying to contact local activists, anybody that would be appropriate, to put a little pressure on the Board of Supervisors or the City Council people or whoever it is to say, just contact, Zach Friend and tell him we'll talk. That's exactly what we're asking for right now, not more than that.
That's a good note to end on. We'll do that. So I think our time's up. Thank you all very much.